and we've got Glen. He's going to take us through some of the components of IEAM and how they work together to really help manage these models.
Hello, I'm Glen Darling, and I would. Whoa, that was loud, wasn't it? Okay, so it jumped right into playing that, and now it's not playing it. Just how easy it is to publish an existing. Hello, I'm Glen Darling, and I would like to show you just how easy it is to publish an existing Docker container into the Open Horizon ecosystem. And I'm specifically going to be using an IBM Edge Application Manager instance of Open Horizon. And the container that I'm going to publish is this Eclipse Mosquito container, just one of the official Docker examples. And latest version is 169, so I'm going to publish that version. And I'm going to use this repo, the Mosquito Easy Open Horizon, which just makes it easy to publish an existing container. And note that the Mosquito and Eclipse Mosquito, they have nothing to do with each other. That one has two T's, this one has one T. Just a coincidence in naming. So first thing I'm going to do is clone that Git repo and cd into there. And if you browse around on that repo, you can see a README. It has a very clear step-by-step explanation of how to do this and why you're doing each step. But I'm just going to go ahead and do it because it's pretty easy and straightforward. So first thing you do is edit the makefile, and you create a name for your software deployment pattern. I'm going to call it MQTT Glen. And I'm going to call this MQTT Glen as well. And then down here, I'm going to change the name of this container to be, that's the Docker container registry reference. And it's not a private registry, so I don't need any container creds. So I'm just going to delete those. And then that's all I need to do there. I do need to do one more thing, though, for the MQTT broker. Down here inside the service name entry, you need to specify any Docker run arguments that you require. So in the example, it publishes port 80 from the host onto port 80 from the container onto the host, but I'm going to fix this to port 1883, which is the insecure port for MQTT brokers, and this to 8883, which is the secure port for the MQTT broker, and then save that, and then I can just go make publish service, and then the Horizon CLI will go ahead and cryptographically sign that container and the deployment string for that container and publish it to the local Open Horizon Exchange. Then I'm going to publish a deployment pattern that just includes that one service. And now that the service and the pattern have been published, all I need to do is go to any one of the edge nodes in the Open Horizon ecosystem that are on this exchange and do make register pattern. And we'll go ahead and register this edge node for that software deployment pattern. And what that is doing is this, that make command is doing this, and it says use HZN agreement list to view the status of agreement making. And over here, I'm watching that command. So I'm running it every 2 seconds in this window. There we go. That means that the agbot has reached out to propose an agreement to the local agent. And in a few seconds, there we go, the agent has accepted the agreement and finalized it. And then it's downloading the Docker container, and then execution will begin when the Docker container is downloaded and sandboxed. So now you can see in the bottom window where I'm watching Docker PS that the Eclipse Mosquito container is running, and the ports that I published onto the host over here on the right side are published. And that's all there is to that. I hope you enjoy Open Horizon and IBM Edge Application Manager. Okay, so let's change to sharing my screen. And we can do a little different kind of presentation about how you make this work. So in that example, I used something called a software deployment pattern. But here I'm going to talk about the two mechanisms that we provide in Open Horizon and IBM Edge Application Manager. So we manage the applications on the Edge nodes, which are either Linux machines, just standalone Linux machines running Docker, or clusters using Kubernetes. But there's two ways to do it. Patterns is one way, and that's what I used in that example. And they're generally easier to use. You directly specify which services should be run on the Edge node. It's less powerful and less flexible, but it's a great way to get started. Then there's the policy mechanism, and this is what we've been talking about with declaring the intent. And it uses constraint-based resolution, and I'll talk in more detail about what that means here. But in general, node policies, you specify policies for each of your nodes. They are resolved against service policies for each of the services, and a service is just one or more containers, and your deployment policies. And the resolution of all of the things in those policies determines whether deployment will occur to a particular node. So let's look at this in more detail using patterns. An Open Horizon pattern, simply a named collection of services. And so you create the appropriate JSON file, and then you do HCN exchange pattern publish. And that's what I did in that video. And then you need to register your nodes using the name that you gave to the pattern. And then all of those services will be deployed on those nodes. So if a node is registered with HCN register -- pattern and the name of some pattern, then it will go ahead and the agent will interact with the components in the management hub to get that to happen. And you can define unique configuration variables for each of the nodes. So a configuration variable is something that the agent will put into the shell environment of the container before it runs it. And so that's a convenient way to be able to configure your services as you deploy them in the field. And one restriction here, though, only one pattern may ever be active on a single node. So if you want to change some of the software that runs on the node, you need to deploy a new pattern that has a change in this full set of services that run on it. The mechanism of policy is much more flexible. So here's an example, an actual JSON file that defines a pattern. And the services that are in the pattern are listed as records in this services array. And each service is identified by a 4-tuple, the organization, the name, the architecture, and the versions. And the name is called service URL, but it's not really a URL. That's the naming is an old artifact, that's all. Now let's talk about policies. There are 3 flavors of policies I mentioned already. In order to use it, you have to define a deployment policy. And the way you do that is HCN exchange deployment add policy, and then give it the name of your file and a name for the policy. And I'll show you the files in a minute. And if you wish, you may also attach a service policy to the service that you're deploying. Service, again, is one or more containers. Then it will be automatically merged into the deployment policy that references the service. And the way you create a service policy is HCN exchange service add policy. Then for the whole mechanism to work, you have to register your edge nodes using a node policy, and that's just HCN register -- policy instead of using HCN register -- pattern. So here's an example policy file. This is the way that node policies and service policies look. And they consist of 2 parts, properties and constraints. Properties are just name value pairs. So my stir var equals my stir val, my int var equals 1, 2, 3. And then constraints are conditions in terms of properties that exist in the other policies. So some var must be greater than or equal to 2000, and other var must be equal to string val. And a deployment policy is similar. It has properties and constraints like the node policy and service policy, but it also has a service reference. So it has those properties and constraints, but it also has a service reference, a single service reference. And again, it's a for tuple to identify the service here. And no, I went on too quickly. At the bottom, you'll notice there's also a user input section. You can use that section to define environment variable values when this deployment policy is activated on particular nodes. So how does policy work? All policies have properties and constraints. And properties are just name value pairs, and constraints are just conditional expressions in terms of those name value pairs. Deployment policy is first automatically merged with any service policy that you've defined for your specified service, if it exists. If it doesn't exist, no problem. And then the agbots will propose that merged policy to the agents on your edge nodes. Then each agent, now this is the agent in the field on the edge device, the decision is being made there. Each agent then evaluates this proposal against its own node policy. If the combined set of policy constraints resolve appropriately, then the agent will accept the proposal and the service deployment will proceed. And even with the pattern mechanism, the pattern mechanism is just a layer, a simplification layer on top of the policy mechanism. And you will have noticed in the window on the right in my previous video that the agbot made a proposal, then the local agent accepted the proposal, and so on, right? So this is all being decided by each agent individually in the field, which makes it very, very difficult to corrupt what the software is running on these edge nodes because the agent is in charge. You'd have to corrupt all the agents to get a botnet out of this system. Constraint resolution. So policy constraints must always be conditional expressions in terms of the properties. And the properties reference must exist. They either have to be specified by another policy under evaluation, or they can be provided automatically by Open Horizon. And it provides a bunch that I'll talk about a little bit later. So both the constraints of the node policy and the constraints of the merged deployment and service policy are evaluated by the agent using the available properties values. And there's also a tool that lets you simulate what effect your policies have. In other words, to test whether your intent, what effect your intent will have in the field before you actually deploy it. So you can use HCN deploy check and have it compare a set of policy files and tell you what effect they will have on which nodes. So there are a few complete examples provided. If you look in the Open Horizon examples repo, there's a few. I mentioned some of them here. And in addition, you can also check out the policy directories in those spots. So in the policy directories of the first two, for example, you'll see all three types of policies. And you'll also see in the third example, which is an example that is for deployment on clusters, you'll see it in a slightly different directory, but basically the same thing. Patterns are simpler, self-contained, one per node, recommended for beginners. Policies are more powerful, and they simplify very large deployment. Working with, the more likely you're going to want to use the policy mechanism because you don't want to address each individual node. It's just too much complication to address each individual node or have a large script with thousands of node entries in it. It becomes quite unmanageable. So both patterns and policies may be updated through the Open Horizon Exchange or using the web UI in the IBM Edge Application Manager to cause deployment changes across your entire fleet. And both mechanisms allow for global or node-specific configuration variables to be set if you need to tweak, adjust some of the knobs through environment variables on each of the devices. And both mechanisms can be used to control file synchronizations using the model management service, which is not something we've really talked much about, but we have a mechanism that enables the code in your containers to have a completely independent lifecycle from files like large neural network model files that can be changed while your code continues to run. And there's a bunch of resources, and that is that for me. So I can stop sharing.
So Glenn, you've got a whole series out on YouTube, right? You've got a sort
Yes.
of a playlist of resources about Open Horizon, and you've got some good links. And I wanted to just make sure that our audience takes away the playlist, as you've got a
Yeah.
dozen or more videos that folks can take advantage of.
Right. So with regard to that, the easiest way to get to that is to type, to go to YouTube, and in the search box, type Open Horizon playlist. And the first link you'll see is the Open Horizon playlist. You click on the view full playlist, and you'll get the full set of them there. I did, I think, 11
I
of the
think we're going
12
to
there.
drop it in the chat. Maybe there's a
Oh, that's
banner
even better.
too.
Even better.
Yeah.